Literature Festival at Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce the first session of the day, Indian Women Mystics, from the Rishikas to the Bhakti poets, presented by Matrubhumi. Please welcome our speakers for the day with a loud round of applause, Arundhathi Subramaniam and Atmaprajnananda Saraswati, in conversation with Philip A. Lutgendorf. Philip is a professor of Hindi and Modern Indian Studies at the University of Iowa. He is the author of The Life of a Text, performing Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas and of Hanuman's Tales, the messages of a divine monkey. His interests include epic performance traditions, folklore, and popular culture, and he maintains a website devoted to Bollywood cinema. He's served since 2010 as president of the American Institute of Indian Studies. An intriguing and engrossing session with translator Philip A. Lutgendorf in conversation with Atmaprajnananda Saraswati, author of Rishikas of the Rgveda, and Arundhathi Subramaniam, poet, author, and editor of the anthology Eating God, a book of Bhakti poetry, who will discuss some of the verses of the women mystics in the Bhakti tradition. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you so much. And welcome everybody, and welcome to the festival. And may this be Shri Ganeshaya Nama, an auspicious shuruat to the first day of the festival in this beautiful hall here. I want to thank Matrubhumi, the sponsor, a paper from Malayalam. I had Kerala. I had the pleasure of meeting a reporter from it yesterday, who is also here presenting at the festival. But our focus is on poetry, and especially poetry by or in the voice of or about women. And our two authors and translators who are here today have written many books, and I'm not going to be able to list them, but I believe quite a few are mentioned in their bio sketches in the packet on the festival, or on the festival website, so you can look them up. But today we're focusing particularly on two books. Swamini Atmaprajnananda's Rishikas of the Rgveda, which is a study of the hymns of the Rgveda that are attributed to female poets or female voices, and Arundhathi Subramaniam's Eating God, an anthology of Bhakti poetry. And given that in South Asia, in terms of the word and poetry, everything begins with the Rgveda. I'm going to begin with Swaminiji and turn to her first. I will mention that I was very charmed to note that her book on Rishikas of the Rgveda begins with a reference to James Joyce's Ulysses, which I appreciated very much. But I'm going to ask Swaminiji to do a little bit of Ved Pat for us as a kind of auspicious beginning. Of course, Ved Pat was at one time forbidden to women. That is Vedic recitation. Women were not permitted to even hear it, much less to utter it themselves. And Swamini has been very involved in the effort to open up the tradition for women. So anyway, if you would please begin for us. Make sure this is on.
Om Shanno Mitrasham Varunaha Shanno Bhavatvaryama Shanna Indro Brahaspatihi Shanno Vishnururukramaha Namo Brahmane Namaste Vayo Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahmasi Tvameva Pratyaksham Brahma Vadishyami Ritam Vadishyami Satyam Vadishyami Tanmamavatu Tadvaktaramavatu Avatu Mam avatu vaktaram. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Yaschandasam Rishabho Vishwarupah Chandobhyodhyamritat Sambhabhuva Samendro Medhaya Sprunotu Amritasya Devadharano Bhuyasam Shariram Me Vicharshanam Jihva Me Madhumattama Karnabhyam Bhuri Vishnuvam Brahmana Koshosi Medhaya Pita Shrutam Me Gopaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Aham Vrikshasaririva Kirti Prishtangiririva Urdhapavitro Vajiniva Swamritamasmi Dravinakam Savarchasam Sumedha Amritokshitaha Iti Trishankor Vedanuvachanam. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Thank you, Swamini. And you should know that she's been dealing with a bad sore throat and is having a little bit of difficulty with the voice, I know. But thank you for that Vak, auspicious beginning. So I'd like to begin with a couple of questions for you that came to mind in reading your book. You often speak about the tradition within the Vedic literature of it being aparusheya, which literally means not from a person. This is a very strong tradition of non-human authorship. So I'd like you to expand a little bit on what that means for you and what that means within the tradition, and how the power of the Vedic corpus relates, in your view, to later traditions, later textual traditions in Hinduism.
Aparushetvam, Purusha means not a man, a person. So, Aparusha means not of human origin. So, these 10,552 hymns in mantras in the Rgveda, that is around 1,052 hymns, Suktam, well said. They were not composed the way Kalidasa composed Abhigyana Sakuntalam or whatever, all the big poets, they composed, there is a craft involved. But in this case, in the mantras in the Rigveda, other Vedas also, they were revealed. So there was no Purushartha, no free will involved, that you get inspiration and then you start writing. No, they were revealed. That is the traditional understanding, and that is the respect we give it to the Shruti. So in the Vedic corpus you have 4 Vedas, Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharvaveda. Each of the Vedas again are divided into 4 parts. You have Samhita, which is all poetry. Then you have Brahmana, which is the explanation of the hymns. Then you have the Aranyakas, meditative writings. Then you have the Upanishads. So all these 4 Vedas, they have these 4 parts, except for Atharva Veda, which does not have an Aranyaka. Now, when Vyasa compiled it, okay, he did not compose, he did not author any of the Vedas, any portion of the Vedas. He just compiled it based on the constitution. Prose, poetry, music, and then Atharvaveda you have all the spells and chants. Atharvaveda is not used in any yagyas. Coming after that was compiled, there was a full stop. Later on, the Smriti text, Smriti means from the memory, and it is attributed to a human being. It could be Dharma Sastra like Gautama Dharma Sastra, Yagyavalkya Dharma Sastra, Narada Dharma Sastra, and Bhagavad Gita is also given the status of Smriti. Now, usually Smriti follows what the Shruti says. In case there is a conflict in opinion between Shruti and Smriti, then Shruti will prevail over Smriti.
Thank you. Shruti trumps Smriti. I'll turn to you, Arundhati, for a question. You gave your anthology a rather provocative title, Eating God, and I thought the audience might enjoy hearing a little bit about why you chose that phrase.
It does sound like a provocative title, but what excited me about these poems in the first place was the fact that they are provocative poems. So the title is in fact from Nammalvar, the 9th and 10th century Tamil mystic, Vaishnava mystic, who speaks of eating God. He says, I have this tremendous appetite for God. And he talks in one of his poems about wanting to devour God. And the poem ends with this line, but before I could, he caught me and devoured me entire. So that particular idea of being able to have this sort of relationship with your God, where you can share some of your most basic appetites. You can talk about wanting to eat him. You can talk about wanting to make love to him. You can talk about doubting him. You can talk about raging with him and wanting to have a flaming quarrel with him. You can hurl cuss words at him. You can throw a tantrum in verse and call it a prayer. To me, this is the excitement of Bhakti poetry. This is the license it allows us. So I wanted the title in some way to reflect that.
You also remind me of the Upanishad phrase, everything is food and the eater of food, right? I think it's in Chandogya. I also wanted to mention, in relation to the women poets who are included in your anthology, about whom I'm about to ask you, I was sufficiently impressed by Mirabai early on in my study of Hindi as a graduate student that when our first child was born, a daughter, my wife and I named her Mira. And she is now 40 years old, and we're very proud of her. But to turn to the poets in your anthology includes both male poets like Nammalvar and also female poets like Andal and Akka Mahadevi and Mirabai and others. And so I wanted to know, do you feel that there are certain commonalities or themes or emotions that you feel in particularly the women poets? Does gender matter in the Bhakti poetry? Perhaps might be one way to look at it, or is that irrelevant?
I'm certainly drawn to Bhakti poets who are both male and female. But what draws me is something that perhaps is evident in a very singular way. It plays itself out in a very particular way in the work of the women poets. So since that's what we're discussing today, I'm interested in the kind of textures, the timbre of the female voice as well in Bhakti poetry. For instance, one of the first things that drew me to this extraordinary tradition of poetry is the notion of devotion itself. I had grown up to think of devotion as some kind of weak-kneed surrender. I thought of devotion as passive worship, as just blind adoration. But when you hear these voices, you're reminded of the fact that devotion is something else. There is a ferocity to these poems. And the ferocity and the way we hear it in the voice of the women mystics in particular interests me because it imbues these voices with something very, very distinctive. When I read, for instance, the work of Akka Mahadevi, the 12th century Kannada woman mystic, I'm struck by the fierceness, the passion, the sensuality, unapologetic sensuality of these poems. So there's a poem, for instance, by Akka Mahadevi where she says, "Take these husbands who die, decay, and feed them to your kitchen fires. Give me the imperishable one." That's a famous translation by A.K. Ramanujan. There's that quality, that audacity, I think, which is what draws me. There's also Lal Ded, the 14th century Kashmiri woman mystic, who speaks of grinding her heart. She says, "I pestled my heart in the mortar of love, roasted it, and offered it to Shankara." There is that kind of desperateness in the yearning as well that draws me. These are translations by Ranjit Hoskote. And then there is Janabai, the 13th century Marathi woman mystic, who says, Janabai's story is extraordinary because she worked as a woman, as a maid servant in the home of Namdev in her time, Namdev being an important mystic in his own right. And Janabai's relationship with her God is one of backslapping familiarity. So she's capable, when she's very tired, of asking Vikthala to come and do the dishes. When she's even more tired, she asks him to come and wash her hair. And there's this amazing poem translated by Arun Kolatkar, which I will read if there is the time, where she says, in fact, "I eat God, I drink God." That's the kind of breezy irreverence, really, that characterizes her approach to her God. So I think what draws me to these poems, and which is abundantly evident in the work of the women poets, is one, this directness, this one-on-one conversation that they seem to be having with their God. So you sometimes feel like you're eavesdropping on a very personal dialogue that's being conducted in the heart, and you're being allowed access to that. And two, this quality of this impunity with which they address the divine. The fact that this God that they're talking to, and this brings me to the third point, the intimacy that characterizes this relationship, because this God that they are talking to is sublime, but he can also be treated as a habitually disobedient member of your family. He's a God whom you can treat as domestic, not just as divine. And that gives these poems a new charge, a new resonance that I don't think we've really heard before. And I see this particularly, as I said, in the work of Janabai, but there are many other mystics as well. And implicit in that is the understanding that the human and the divine cannot be kept apart for very long, however hard they try. The union is just a matter of time. So nothing is transgressive, nothing is taboo, nothing is sacrilegious. You can address this divine in any way you choose. He can be invited into every festering crevice of your consciousness, and it will be transformed. And the last point, or perhaps the penultimate one that I'd like to mention, is the attitude to the body, which particularly interests me in the women mystics, because in the finest bhakti poetry, I mean, there are many that tell us that the body is perishable, subject to decay, we must look beyond it, and so on. But there are also some of these incredible poems that remind us that the body and flesh do not share an oppositional relationship, that the body is in fact an instrument of knowing. The body is the sanctum that houses the sacred, and therefore it is in fact a tremendous resource. So Soirabai, the 14th century Marathi woman mystic, has this poem in which she says, "If menstrual blood makes me impure, show me who wasn't born of that blood." So there is this single poem in which a Dalit woman mystic questions hierarchies of caste, of class, of gender, and even more fundamentally, the hierarchy between the human and the divine. So this is played out time and again in these poems, which draws me to them very, very deeply. There is, for instance, Akka Mahadevi again, who walks the streets, a naked woman mystic, who in her poem says, and this is again an example of wearing the body with a certain abandon, when she says, you know, I walk the streets this way, and who are we attempting to conceal this body from? When the onlooker is everywhere, what can we cover? What can we conceal? And I also believe that this quality, this ability to look at the body and see that the erotic and the existential are not in contradiction, is something that we find in the male mystics as well, particularly when they speak in the female voice. You know, so perhaps later I'd like to read a poem by Annamacharya, the 15th century mystic, where when he speaks in the voice of the woman, the voice is sensual, provocative, feisty, confident. When he speaks in the male voice, it's much more supplicating. It's much more the voice of the seeker of a particular kind.
And heeding the very good point made by Pico Iyer just now in the keynote, we won't call that appropriation. Today, anyway, yeah. Swamini, your book identifies 27 Rishikas, that is to say, women rishis, in Rgveda. But given the fact that there are something like 400 male figures, rishis, would you want to comment on this, you know, sort of imbalance, gender imbalance, let's say, in the scripture?
Nothing has changed in 7,500 years. 27 by 400 makes around less than 10%, around 7-8%, right? And then one cannot become a rishi, you know, there is no free will involved. It's one's own tapas. Then if something is revealed, something is revealed. There are hymns which has only one mantra. There are hymns which has 47 mantras. So we are thankful. I personally feel, because some of the Rishikas, they are also categorized as alternate Rishikas. Means it could be Mr. A, it could be Ms. B, either of them. Then, so my opinion is, even if one was there out of 400 rishis in the Rgveda, even if there was one woman, the statement is made. We have Urvashi as a Rishika, Pururava Urvashi. So she is a Rishika. When she is addressing to Pururava, Pururava is the Devata, and when Pururava addresses to Urvashi, then he is the Rishi and she is the Devata. So there is Vishwamitra Mandala, there is Vashishta Mandala. So unlike when you go to the few temples or some orthodox meetings, they will have male and female separate, or the women, even in Buddhism, the women are encouraged to sit at the back and leave the front rows for the male. There is no such aage piche in Rgveda. So Urvashi shares the same status as Vasishtha or Vishwamitra. That is a very wonderful thing. I'm very happy that in spite of some controversial content of these hymns, they have not been edited, they have not been deleted.
In terms of the content of the various Rishika hymns, would you, are they all, would you say, profound? Are they all dealing with sort of profound metaphysical matters? Do they vary in their subject matter? Are there hints of what we might call everyday life, or sort of everyday life concerns that come through these mantras?
Some of them are profound in the whole Rgveda. Some of them are profound. Quite a few not so profound hymns are there. Erotic elements are also there. There are dialogues between two rishis or one rishi, one devata, which the Western German authors, they found it very difficult to translate. So they translated those untranslatable hymns in German. Say, Indrani. In Indrani, it is there. Oh, Lopamudra and Agastya. That is translated into German. English translation not available. In Indrani, there are two mantras which has not been translated at all, not even into German. So, I mean, I would say that they didn't have this, conditioned mind that we have, those, censorship, they didn't have it. So, whatever was envisioned by a rishi or rishika, it is there. You must remember that since 7,500 years, it is in the Shruti Parampara. And Rgveda has been accepted, what do you call it, enlisted in the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage, 2008. So, they have not edited.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, you talked about some of the possibly controversial content. Would you say more about that?
She's supposed to be on my side. In Agastya Lopamudra, there are only 3 mantras. Now, Lopamudra was a princess. Then her father, when the king, that time when the rishis were in vogue, so Agastya was a great tapasvi. He was always in tapas. And this princess, finally she, dropping all her inhibitions, she says, we are becoming old, come and make love to me. Otherwise, there won't be progeny. So first mantra, Lopamudra, says, come and make love to me. Then Agastya says something. Then there is a brahmachari, chota fellow. Chota fellow says something because he has overheard the conversation between the husband and wife. So this is Agastya Lopamudra. There is Romasha, another Rishika. She was getting old, and somebody not wanting to get married is a different thing, but somebody, a girl wanting to get married but not being able to get married, that frustration is there in the Romasha.
And then there is 1086, the Vrishakapi hymn, about, which I won't go into, but I've written a lot about it in my Hanuman book, because of its, sometimes people think it has something to do with later Hanuman lore. But yeah, and it's a very interesting and controversial hymn. Well, I'll just tell you this much. It's a sort of a triangle dialogue. It has at least 3 speakers. Indra, his wife, who is referred to as Indrani, as Swamiji pointed out, and then this character known as Vrishakapi, which, you know, seems to mean bull monkey, aggressive male monkey. And that is, in fact, how he comes across in the hymn. He's kind of sexually aggressive. And Indra and Indrani are talking about him. And it's a very interesting, and he's a friend of Indra's, but he's also a kind of a friend of Indrani's, and it all gets very interesting. And scholars have been scratching their heads over it for hundreds of years. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that and turn back to Arundhati. I note that your anthology is somewhat unconventional in structure, in the sense that you're not chronological, which I think a lot of people do in Bhakti anthologies, nor do you group the poets, all the poems by one person in one section. Instead, you've chosen a thematic organization, and I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about why you chose to structure it that way.
My own entry point into this is really as a poet and as a seeker. So as someone who writes, but more importantly, listens to poetry, I've grown up on several of these poems. I've watched some of them being performed in dance recitals. My own entry point is tonal. The tone of these poems is what excites me. And as a seeker myself, I think it's knowing that this spectrum of tones is possible when having a conversation with the innermost core of one's being, that anything is possible. You can talk to this God any way you like. For me, that is the deepest and strongest resonance of these poems. That's why I'm drawn to them. So, as I say at the very start, as a seeker, these poems have offered me consolation, they've offered me companionship, they've offered me signposts on a journey that often seems scarily unmapped. And it helps me a great deal to know that there are others who've shaken a fist in quite the same way that I do today at their gods, wondered about whether this God exists at all, shared their fears, their deepest fears of extinction with him or her, talked about their need to devour this God, talked about their need to make love to this God, talked about the need for freedom, talked about the need for ecstasy and extinction all at once. And so there seemed to be an inner logic really to this organization of the book for me. The logic was just to be able to explore this whole welter of tones with which the divine is addressed in the subcontinent.
What are some of the sections?
Well, it starts with yearning, it moves on, it starts with longing, it moves on to a very intense yearning. But at the very beginning, even before the yearning begins, there are the Bhakti poets telling you, don't take on Bhakti. It's a dangerous business. It can unmake your life. Don't take it on unless you're ready for it. So there's a note of caution at the very start, and it's amazing how many of the Bhakti poets from across the subcontinent remind us of just how dangerous it is. So these are poets who take you gradually from yearning to doubt, to fear, to erotic union. They remind you that the closer you get to the site of union, and many of them speak of it as sexual union, but you realize that as soon as you come to the rising temperature of this bedchamber, whether it's erotic or mystical, things get even more dangerous, even more out of control. So you're watching lots of conventional roles dissolve. You no longer know who the boss is. Is it God or is it the Bhakta? Is it the divine or is it the human? Who has the upper hand? You're no longer sure. And then from there are poems of rage. There are poems that are actually a whole litany of swear words hurled at this god. And all of it, as I said, is acceptable because it's rooted in this deep intimacy. This is about loving and therefore feeling free to quarrel with one who is dearest to you. It moves on finally to ecstasy and then to liberation.
Swamini, could you talk a little bit about the technical meaning of a rishi? Rishi and a rishika. How, in your view, how did people acquire this status? Was it a matter of effort or will? What's the nature of the rishi persona? Rishika. Yeah.
Definition is same. We have a general understanding of a rishi, a yati, a muni, a sadhu, a sannyasi. These are all technical things. So in case of rishi, although when we see a matted fellow, then we think it's a rishi. As per the Veda, the definition is yasya bhakyam sa rishi. Whosoever is speaking is the rishi. To whom it is addressed is the devata. So, there are around 12 dialogues in Rgveda based on which dramas have been composed. Say, a Pururuba Urvashi dialogue, based on that Vikrama Urvashiyam by Kalidasa was composed. So, in case of a dialogue, say Yama Yami or Pururuba Urvashi, so the verses that Urvashi is telling, she is the Rishika and Pururuba is the Devata. When Pururuba says, why are you leaving me? Then Pururuba is the Rishi and Urvashi is the Devata. Somewhat got it? It's a technical definition. That whosoever is speaking is the Rishi. The meaning is Rishati Janati Ti Rishi. One who knows, one who can see far ahead. They are also called Kavis because they can see more than what we can see.
And of course, Rishi itself comes from the verb to see, drish.
Yes, yes.
And they're seers. And there's this really interesting synesthesia, to use a modern word, 100-rupee word, but I mean, means a merging of the senses. So the rishis see the mantras, which are heard, and it becomes shruti, which is that which is heard. So you have this kind of, both seeing and hearing are involved in the revelation.
But at the supra level, not at this level.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as being the contribution of the Vedas towards literature, besides being considered as religious texts?
Yeah, people like me, whatever you might be slotting me in, we always take the Vedas as religious texts. It is not. Vedas is the source book for all the disciplines. Say literature. The whole poetry is from Rgveda. Prose also from Yajurveda. Then drama, all those dialogue suktas, dialogue hymns are there. Based on that, dramas have been written. Then it is the source book for history, geography, sociology, economics, and the social vyavastha that was prevalent at that time. So I cannot claim that it is religious, Rgveda only, I am the authority, all the Swamis are the authority. No, it's not that. It is available, and just anybody can start the research and try to see what is the meaning. There are, Sayana Bhashya, when Sayana wrote a commentary on the Vedas, so he put, in a ritualistic way, okay, this mantra has to be used like this, not necessarily. Yaska, 700 BCE, before Panini. He gave the etymological meaning of the Vedic hymns. Aurobindo went into deep meditation, gave the spiritual meaning. And there has not been a break in the research of the literature of Rgveda. It is continuing. It's a continuous parampara.
Arundhati, would you like to read? I want to leave time for Q&A, but would you like to read some poems, some of your favorites from the anthology? Share with us.
Unlike Swamini, I'm afraid I will not be able to read them in the original because these are in multiple languages and I rely on the translations as well as much as anyone else. But I'd like to start with this particular poem that I mentioned earlier by Janabai, the 13th century woman mystic, Marathi woman mystic, in a translation by Arun Kolatkar. I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. Jenny says, God is within, God is without, and what's more, there's God to spare. Should we wait for the sound to subside?
It's some kind of cosmic drone.
The mic is not devoid of God. Here's Soirabai, the 14th century Dalit woman mystic whom I mentioned, translated here by Jerry Pinto and Neela Bhagwat. You say some bodies are untouchable. Tell me what you say of the soul. You say defilement is born in the body. If menstrual blood makes me impure, show me who wasn't born of that blood. This blood of mine fertilizes the world. Tell me who has not sprung from this source. Soira says, this impurity is the cornerstone of your world. That's why I praise only Panduranga, who lives in every body, pure, impure. One of the things that's always drawn me to these poems, apart from some of the factors I mentioned earlier, is the fact that there is nothing simplistic. We often believe that bhakti, because it suggests devotion, means some kind of excess of emotion by those who are incapable of intelligence, those who are incapable of deep thought. But one of the wonderful things about this poetry is that it reminds you time and again that there's nothing jingoistic at work. These are some of the finest minds, clearly, because here's this poem by Akka Mahadevi, translated by A.K. Ramanujan, in which you're reminded of just how complex this whole business of yearning is. So Akka, in the same poem, talks of yearning for God, but she also says, I've had enough of yearning. I don't need to yearn anymore. All in the course of the same poem, she tells you that it's possible to want him and not to want him all at the same time. So you're reminded of just how complex bhakti is, and the fact that these people knew, many of these mystics were fully aware that bhakti is really a dangerous, radical science of the heart that they were consciously espousing. Better than meeting and mating all at once is the pleasure of mating once after being far apart. When he's away, I cannot wait to get a glimpse of him. Friend, when will I have it both ways? To be with him, yet not with him. My Lord, white as jasmine. And I'm going to conclude with a poem by a male mystic, the one I mentioned earlier, Annamacharya. When the male mystics, as I said, when many of them adopt a female voice, there is a certain abandon to the poems. And this is one of the finest examples of it, because when Annamacharya addresses his god, Venkatesha of Tirupati, he adopts in some of these poems the voice of a woman seeker. But this is not just any woman seeker. This is the goddess herself. This is the goddess Alamelumanga, who is a feisty goddess. She's a vain goddess. She has a very good opinion of herself. So in this poem, she praises her god. She's singing his praises. But as you hear it, you're fully aware of the fact that if there's anyone she's praising, it's herself. So it has the refrain, he's the master, time and again. But at the end of the poem, you really don't know who has the upper hand. Is it God, or is it Bhakta? Is it Venkatesha, or is it Alamelumanga? It's a playful poem, and what excites me is that it works perfectly as a romantic poem. It also works perfectly as a sacred poem. It's translated here by V. Narayana Rao and David Shulman. He's the master. What can I say when he says I'm better than all the others? I don't even have to ask. He takes whatever I say as a command. Why should I brag? My husband is under my thumb. He's the master. Who am I to serve him when he takes joy in serving me? How can I tell you the 1,000 ways he's with me? He knows everything, just like God. And he praises me. He's the master. I'm always in his arms. He's always laughing with me. He's the god on the hill. And I'm Alamelumanga. Do I have to make a statement? He's my slave. He's the master. Thank you.
That poem reminded me of one of the most beautiful poems that you quote in your anthology, which is Rgveda 10:125, in praise of the goddess of speech. And would you mind if I read a little bit of the English of that? If I read that, is that all right? Yeah, we have a little time, just a bit, because it is speaking in Vagambrani. It is speaking. The Rishikas speaks in the voice of the goddess of voice, of speech, who is, in a sense, one of the most primal deities of the Rgveda and is feminine, unlike most of the deities in the Rgveda. And I'll just read the beginning of it. Or would you like to? Or would you like to read the English? Okay, you do it. Yeah, better.
Aham rudre bhir vasubhischarami, aham adityai rita vishwadevaihi, aham mitra varunobha vibharmi, aham indragni, aham aishvinobha. I travel with the Rudras and the Vasus, with the Adityas and all gods I wander. I hold aloft both Varuna and Mitra, Indra and Agni, and the pair of Ashwins. Aham somam ahanasam vibharmi, aham tvashtaramutta pushanam bhagam, aham dadhami dravinam bhavishmate, supravye yajamanaya sunvate. I cherish and sustain high swelling soma, and tvashta I support, pushan and bhaga. I load with wealth the zealous sacrificer who pours the juice and offers the oblation. Aham Rashtri Sangamani Vasunam Chikitushi Prathama Yagyanam Tam Ma Deva Vededo Purutra Bhuri Sthatram Bhurya Veshayantim. I am the queen, the gatherer up of treasures, most thoughtful, first of those who merit worship. Thus gods have established me in many places, with many homes to enter and abide in.
Yeah. You get that, I am, aham, 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 over and over again, and aham rashtri, I am the queen. I love that line. But we want to have time to take your questions for our speakers. So can somebody take charge of giving microphones to people? Yeah.
Hello, madam, sir. I was deeply moved by the fact that you shared about the mystic and bhakti poets. And I had a question regarding Mirabai's poetry. Like one famous line is, Syam mane chakar rakho ji. And then you have metaphysical poets like John Donne, which have fierce lines like, take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. How do you measure that against Kolatkar's work, who has written works like Jejuri, which are dripping with skepticism towards a faith? For the, like, there is this poetry in which they are in a bus journey and they are going to the town to see this goddess, whose name I am forgetting right now. Kandoba. And they are headed to Jejuri. So how do you judge that, the metaphysical poet of England to the bhakti poets in India, to that of Kolatkar's work, who has also evolved during the age?
It's a wonderful question. I just wish we had a lot of time, but I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. I think it's a very fine parallel you draw with John Donne, because I remember when I first read some of these bhakti poets, I was reminded of that batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet, but it'll come to me. But batter my heart was strong. So yes, I think that is that sense of urgency, of this kind of fierce desire, sometimes carnal, sometimes neurotic, desperate desire for something unnameable, is what is shared by these bhakti poets, as with other mystics and seekers all over the world, John Donne certainly being one of them. Arun Kolatkar, if we were to come to him, he's translated Janabai here, but Arun Kolatkar would never have seen himself as a mystic poet. He was certainly a poet, not a mystic. But in Jejuri, which is the book that you mentioned, it's a book that talks of a certain skepticism about journeys of faith, but it's also a book with that remarkable poem called The Beggar Woman. I don't know if you remember it. In that particular poem, here is this man going from temple to temple where he doesn't find any evidence of the sacred, but in The Beggar Woman, a woman whom he meets outside just bumps into her. And there is a moment in which there is contact. The two of them look each other in the eye. And that poem, I don't know how you would describe it. For me, it's a darshan moment. There is darshan happening, but it's not happening in any conventional citadel of the sacred.
And if I could just add, A.K. Ramanujan, some of whose translations you've included in the anthology, I had the honor to study with him, and I know that he himself would never have, he didn't consider himself as having a mystic bone in his body, and yet he was drawn to the poetry of great mystics in Kannada and Tamil, and he's left us some of the most eloquent and beautiful translations of them. So it's kind of interesting that way. I saw a question.
Good morning. It was very, very exciting to see the poetry of Akka Mahadevi being read out, coming from Karnataka and having studied it in Kannada myself. My question is, I want to take off from the last line of the first poem you read out. There's enough of God to spare for everyone, right? Most of this love that is expressed in this poetry is still located within a heteronormative setup. A man and a woman, and primarily God is the man. Have there been any instances of queering this in the Indian mystical Bhakti tradition?
It's a good question. You know, based on the kind of reading that I have done, what I can certainly say is that there are many poems in which gender roles are so fluid that you're no longer sure of whether this is man or woman. Those are the poems that's what I talked about towards the middle of the book. Those are the poems that particularly excite me. For instance, when I first started on these poems, I was convinced that this would be a passive female devotee and an active male god. I thought that would be those equations. Those would be the equations I would encounter. But that was in itself far from the truth. For one, in Jayadeva, God pines as much for Bhakta as Bhakta for God. You're no longer sure, really, who's playing what role, active, passive, anymore. And when you come to Saleh Bega, the Uriya poet of the 17th century, Radha kicks Krishna out of bed. So there is a very different kind of sexual relationship as well that is being explored time and again. And when it comes to Narsi Mehta's poetry as well, yes, it's very erotic. You have the gopi tying Krishna's arms to the bedpost in one poem, so you know who has the upper hand in that encounter. But you also know that the same Krishna is capable of cross-dressing. So you really don't know at some point when Krishna sits on the swing with his long braid, and you really don't know who the gopi is and who Krishna is at this point. Who's playing what role? So power equations are in a state of hectic disarray. Gender roles are in a state of hectic disarray. This whole question of yearning but for what? Sometimes we don't quite know. The yearning has consumed one to a point when you can annihilate the self, but you can annihilate God as well. You know, so Tukaram finally, in the last poem of this book, Tukaram says, for me, God is dead. So in such a spectrum of voices, I think rather than I don't even see it after a point as normative as much as really interrogating every conceivable norm in its own way. And in fact, inviting us to move beyond gender, inviting us to move beyond region, caste, class in their own ways. There are also conservative elements, I won't deny that. But I think it's important to also listen to these voices of freedom and to heed those. And those have helped me enormously.
May I ask for a question addressed to Swamini Atmaprajnananda? Anybody? Sir? Yeah.
It may not be particularly to Swamini, but she can answer if she likes. I would also like to know the difference between the women mystic poets and the male voices. What was the pattern of ideas, thoughts, which were predominant among the male voices? Because in the Indian tradition, the male devotee, like Swami is an ascetic. He shies away from sensuality, sex, eroticism, and so on, except in the relationship between Radha and Krishna, which is celebrated. But here you have female voices, and they may not be all of them, like where eroticism and devotion comes together. Now, so what do you think is the predominant voice, having compared the women and the male voices? Who represents the mystic tradition in India? Thank you.
See, the concept of bhakti is not in the Vedas. In the Vedas, we have upasana. you meditate upon a particular deity. Then there are different types of upasana. Bhakti came maybe 1200 common era. So in the hints of the rishis or rishikas, they are all dedicated to a particular devata. So whatever comes to the mind, that is how it is.
Yes, I just maybe invite you to look at the book, because in fact the book doesn't organize this on the basis of gender. So it is inviting us to listen to these voices in polyphony in a way. But within that, since our discussion was on women mystics, and since that's a personal area of preoccupation, I talked about them. But you will find pretty much the same tropes. There is the same rage, the same longing, the same despair, the same doubt in all of them. It's how it is articulated that perhaps changes, as it must. When I talked about the women, I talked about how it was singular in this case. You'll find, I don't want to make a generalization about all men either, but I think you will find, as I said, something very distinctive about a Nammalvar's flagrant, unabashed need to devour God. That's one kind of Vaishnava mysticism. The early part of Vaishnava mysticism, in fact, goes well before Jayadeva, well before 1200. It starts in Tamil in the 6th century onwards. So you'll find that kind of articulation. You'll find the more dispassionate mystical voice as well. When you hear Basavarna, you will find Tukaram, who's capable of traversing the whole gamut of voices, from doubt to bargaining with his God. He says, I'm a grocer, I'm going to bargain with you. There is such a variety that it's going to take more than a session, I think, to talk about that. So I would invite you to pick up the book.
We are out of time, and I ask you to join me